Geronimo, whose birth name was Guayacla, was born into a world defined by both conflict and harmony, a delicate balance of survival amid the unforgiving deserts and towering mountains of the American Southwest. His Chiricahua Apache ancestors had roamed these lands for centuries, knowing every canyon, mesa, and valley like the back of their hands. They thrived in what many outsiders considered a barren wasteland, finding sustenance, shelter, and community in the rugged terrain. But the 19th century brought with it a series of challenges that would test even the most resilient of peoples. The arrival of foreign powers vying for control of the very earth beneath their feet. As a child, Guayacla witnessed the growing tensions between his people and the Mexican government. Raids and skirmishes were not uncommon, and the Apache were frequently caught in the middle of a larger geopolitical struggle. It was during one such raid by Mexican soldiers that young Geronimo's life took a dark turn, a tragedy that would forever shape his path. On that fateful day, as he returned to his camp, he found his mother, wife, and 3 children massacred. The raw grief and rage that surged through him in that moment transformed him into something more than just a man. He became a symbol of defiance and vengeance. The legend of Geronimo was born out of this tragedy, a man who vowed never to rest until he exacted revenge on those who had wronged him and his people. With each passing year, his reputation grew. He became a thorn in the side of both Mexican and American forces, leading daring raids, orchestrating tactical escapes, and evading capture time and again. Geronimo was not just a warrior, but a strategist. He knew how to use the land to his advantage, turning the rugged landscape of the Southwest into his greatest ally. His enemies, however, saw him as a ghost, an elusive figure who could never be cornered or subdued. His confrontations with both the Mexican and American governments escalated, culminating in a series of campaigns that left his name etched in the annals of history. The United States government, which was rapidly expanding westward, saw the Apache as an obstacle to its manifest destiny. Geronimo, leading a small band of warriors and their families, refused to be subjugated. For years, he led his people through the inhospitable terrain of Arizona and New Mexico, evading capture by an increasingly frustrated U.S. Army. His knowledge of the land was unparalleled, allowing him and his followers to move swiftly and unpredictably through the deserts, mountains, and canyons. The tension reached its peak in 1886 when General Nelson Miles, a renowned military leader, was tasked with capturing the elusive Apache leader. The chase that followed was nothing short of legendary. For months, Geronimo and his small group of warriors evaded capture, outwitting the much larger U.S. forces time and time again. At one point, Geronimo even surrendered, only to change his mind and escape into the wilderness once more, leaving his pursuers grasping at thin air. But even the most resilient warriors cannot fight forever. In September of 1886, Geronimo, realizing that the survival of his people was at stake, made the difficult decision to surrender. His capture marked the end of the Apache resistance in the Southwest, but it did not mark the end of his legacy. Geronimo was sent into exile in Florida, far from the land he had fought so hard to protect. Though confined, his spirit remained unbroken, and he became a symbol of native resistance across the United States. Despite being a prisoner of war for the remainder of his life, Geronimo's presence commanded respect. He was paraded around at fairs, exhibitions, and even attended the inauguration of President Theodore Roosevelt. But even in these moments, Geronimo was not simply a curiosity for the American public. He was a reminder of the fierce resistance and struggle for native sovereignty. He understood his role as a symbol, using his fame to tell his story, ensuring that the Apache resistance was not forgotten. As we reflect on Geronimo's life, it is important to recognize that his legacy extends far beyond his battles and his famous escapes. Geronimo represents the unyielding will of a people who refuse to be erased from history, a testament to the resilience of the Native American tribes who faced overwhelming odds. His story is a reminder that the history of the American Southwest is not just one of westward expansion and conquest, but also one of survival, resistance, and the profound connection between people and the land they call home. Geronimo's story does not end with his surrender. Instead, it continues to inspire generations of Native Americans who see in him a symbol of strength, perseverance, and defiance in the face of injustice. His life was a reflection of the enduring struggle of indigenous peoples to preserve their culture, their way of life, and their lands, even when faced with insurmountable challenges. Today, Geronimo's name is remembered not just as that of a legendary warrior, but as a representation of the ongoing fight for native sovereignty and recognition in a world that has often sought to silence their voices. In the vast tapestry of American history, Geronimo's life stands out as a beacon of resilience and defiance, a reminder that the story of the United States is incomplete without acknowledging the struggles and contributions of its native peoples. His legacy is one that endures, not just in the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, but in the hearts of those who continue to fight for justice, equality, and the right to exist on their own terms. As we peel back the layers of history, we see not just a man, but a movement. Geronimo's life is a reflection of the broader struggles faced by indigenous peoples across the Americas, a struggle that continues to this day. His story is one of survival, of defiance, and of the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. Geronimo's life was marked by a deep connection to his family and the traditional ways of the Apache people. His birth name, Goya Goyle, meaning the one who yawns, was bestowed upon him in the Mescalcoa dialect of the Apache language. This name, while seemingly ordinary, carried a significant weight in Apache culture, where names often reflected the natural world or personal attributes. However, it was not long before the name Geronimo became synonymous with defiance and resistance. The transformation of his identity from Goya Goyle to Geronimo signaled his evolution from a young Apache boy into a legendary figure whose name would resonate through history. Geronimo's family was large, comprising 3 brothers and 4 sisters, each contributing to the tightly knit community that was essential to Apache life. After the loss of his father, young Goya Goyle was guided by his mother to live with the Chehen band of the Apache. It was in this environment that he was immersed in the rich cultural traditions of his people. His early years were spent learning the survival skills, spiritual teachings, and customs that were vital to the Apache way of life. These teachings would later form the foundation of his leadership and resistance against the encroaching forces that sought to displace his people. At the age of 17, Geronimo entered into his first marriage with Elope, a woman from the Nedni Chiricahua band. This union marked the beginning of a family that would eventually grow, as Geronimo became a father to 3 children. Elope was the first of 9 wives that Geronimo would take over the course of his life, a reflection of both Apache customs and the personal losses he would suffer. His marriages and children were central to his life, grounding him in the responsibilities of family even as the world around him became increasingly hostile. But Geronimo's life would take a dark and tragic turn on March 5, 1851. On that day, a Mexican force of 400 soldiers, led by Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco, launched a brutal attack on Geronimo's camp near Llanos, an area known to the Apache as Cascais. This was not a random assault, but a calculated military strike driven by previous conflicts between the Apache and the Mexican forces. The Apache had long engaged in raids against Mexican settlements, where they took livestock and valuables, often clashing with Mexican militias. These raids were both a means of survival and a way to assert their autonomy in a region increasingly dominated by outside forces. However, the attack on Cascais was devastating on a personal level for Geronimo. The men of the camp, including Geronimo, were away trading in town when the soldiers descended upon the settlement. In their absence, the camp was defenseless. When Geronimo returned, he was greeted with a scene of unimaginable horror. His wife, Elope, his 3 children, and his mother were all killed in the attack. This profound and personal loss ignited a fire of vengeance within Geronimo, a fire that would burn for the rest of his life. From that moment on, Geronimo harbored an intense hatred for the Mexican soldiers who had taken everything from him. His grief quickly turned to rage, and that rage fueled his desire for revenge. Geronimo and his followers embarked on a relentless campaign of retaliation against Mexican forces. They engaged in frequent raids, attacking settlements, and killing Mexican soldiers and civilians alike. To Geronimo, these acts of violence were not merely about revenge, but also about survival. Every strike against the Mexicans was a message, a refusal to be subjugated or erased. For Geronimo, the loss of his family was a defining moment. It shaped his worldview and cemented his role as a leader and warrior. His hatred for the Mexicans was not born out of a singular event, but was compounded by years of conflict and bloodshed between the Apache and the Mexican government. The attack on his family was merely the culmination of a long history of violence between the two groups, a violence that Geronimo would perpetuate in his quest for justice. Geronimo's reputation as a fierce and relentless warrior grew with each raid he led. His name became a symbol of Apache resistance not only against the Mexicans, but also against the encroaching American settlers who were beginning to push further into Apache territory. The Apache Wars, which spanned several decades, were marked by countless skirmishes, battles, and raids, with Geronimo at the forefront of many of them. His leadership was characterized by his deep knowledge of the land, his tactical brilliance, and his ability to inspire loyalty among his followers. Yet, for all his ferocity in battle, Geronimo was also a man of great complexity. He was driven by a profound love for his people and a desire to preserve their way of life. His resistance was not just about revenge. It was about fighting for the survival of his culture in the face of overwhelming odds. The Apache were a proud and independent people, and Geronimo embodied that spirit of defiance. He refused to submit, even when faced with impossible odds. As Geronimo continued to lead his people in their fight for survival, his legend only grew. He became a symbol not just of the Apache struggle, but of the broader Native American resistance against the forces of colonization and displacement. His ability to evade capture, outsmart his enemies, and inspire his people made him a figure of mythic proportions. To the American and Mexican forces, Geronimo was a ghost, a figure who seemed to vanish into the desert only to reappear when least expected. But Geronimo's story is not just one of battles and bloodshed. It is also a story of profound loss and resilience. The personal tragedy that drove him to take up arms was mirrored by the larger tragedy faced by the Apache people as they were slowly pushed from their ancestral lands. The attack on Cascade was just one chapter in a much larger story of displacement, violence, and resistance. Geronimo's fight was a fight for survival, not just for himself, but for his people and their way of life. In the end, Geronimo's life is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. His story is one of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, of a man who refused to be broken even when the world around him was falling apart. His legacy lives on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of those who continue to fight for justice and recognition for Native American peoples. Geronimo's life was shaped by a seething hatred toward Mexicans, born from the deep personal loss he suffered at their hands. His animosity for the Mexicans far outweighed his feelings toward the Americans, even though both nations sought to subjugate the Apache people. This distinction in his feelings toward the two groups can be traced back to the tragic events of 1851, when his family was slaughtered by Mexican soldiers. That moment, forever etched in his memory, ignited a desire for vengeance that would drive him throughout his adult life. Apache groups like the Chiricahua, to which Geronimo belonged, were known for their fierce independence and warrior culture. Alongside other Apachean groups, such as the Western Apache, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, and Plains Apache, formerly Kiowa Apache, they dominated the Southwest. The Apaches' raiding culture was both a survival mechanism and a strategic tool in their efforts to resist colonization. Raids on Spanish and Mexican settlements had been a defining feature of Apache resistance since the late 17th century. The Spanish, recognizing the threat posed by the Apaches, established presidios, fortified military outposts, at Llanos in 1685 and at Fronteras in 1690. These were meant to protect their northern territories, particularly in Chihuahua and northeastern Sonora, which were then part of Opata lands. However, these defenses did little to quell the Apache. By the early 19th century, Mexico found itself overwhelmed by the frequency and ferocity of Apache raids. In 1835, the Mexican government resorted to offering bounties on Apache scalps, signaling a new, more brutal phase of the conflict. 2 years later, Mongas Coloradas, one of the most prominent Apache chiefs and war leaders, rose to prominence. Under his leadership, the raids on Mexican villages intensified, and the cycle of violence escalated further. Geronimo, though, not yet the famous warrior he would become, grew up during this period of heightened conflict, absorbing the lessons of warfare and survival from his elders. The scope of the Apache raids on Mexico was staggering. Between 1820 and 1835, an estimated 5,000 Mexicans were killed in these raids, and around 100 settlements were completely destroyed. No region was immune to the brutal tactics of the Apache raiders. They targeted villages, farms, and even military outposts, capturing livestock and other resources. Raiding became deeply ingrained in Apache culture, not just as a means of economic sustenance, but as a form of warfare. The lines between raiding for survival and acts of violence against enemies blurred, creating a culture where warfare and daily life were intertwined. For the Apache, raiding was an essential part of their existence. It allowed them to acquire the goods necessary for survival in the harsh desert environment, from food to horses. But it was also a way of asserting dominance over their enemies, particularly the Mexicans. The raids were often marked by extreme violence, with captives taken and, in some cases, tortured or killed. The Mexican response to these raids was equally brutal. Retaliatory strikes against the Apache were carried out with the same level of savagery, targeting not just the warriors but women, children, and the elderly as well. This cycle of raiding and revenge became self-perpetuating, feeding a culture of vengeance that persisted for generations. Geronimo emerged as one of the key figures in this era of constant conflict. From 1850 to 1886, he led numerous raids and attacks against both Mexicans and Americans. His motivations were deeply personal. After witnessing the slaughter of his family, he was consumed by a desire for vengeance, particularly against the Mexicans who had inflicted the tragedy upon him. This desire drove him to commit acts of brutality that even surpassed those of his fellow Apache leaders. For Geronimo, every raid, every skirmish was a way to exact revenge for the pain he had suffered. During this period, Geronimo's reputation as a fierce warrior grew. He became a central figure in the ongoing Apache resistance, his name feared by both Mexicans and Americans alike. His ability to evade capture, his strategic brilliance in guerrilla warfare, and his sheer determination made him a formidable adversary. However, his leadership within his own tribe, the Chiricahua, was complex. While he was respected for his prowess in battle, he was not universally liked. His refusal to submit to American demands created tension within the tribe. Many Apache leaders saw the futility of continued resistance against the American government and sought to negotiate terms for peace. Geronimo, however, steadfastly refused to yield, fearing that surrender would mean the end of the Apache way of life. As Geronimo's renown grew, so did his involvement in the broader Apache resistance. His leadership, in many ways, was a continuation of the struggles initiated by other influential Apache figures, including his leader and mentor, Mongas Coloradas. Mongas, who had long fought against both Mexican and American forces, sought Geronimo's assistance in avenging the wrongs committed by the Mexicans, particularly the massacre that had claimed the lives of Geronimo's family. This marked a critical turning point in Geronimo's life, cementing his role as a key leader in the Apache resistance. It was during one of these battles against Mexican forces that Geronimo earned the name by which he is most widely known today. According to legend, the name Geronimo was bestowed upon him after a fierce encounter in which he fought Mexican soldiers with nothing but a knife, fearlessly facing a barrage of bullets. The origin of the name remains a subject of historical debate. Some suggest that Mexican soldiers, in the heat of battle, invoked the name of Saint Jerome, San Geronimo in Spanish, perhaps as a desperate plea for divine intervention. Others speculate that Geronimo may have been a corrupted approximation of his Apache name, Goya, though this theory is less likely due to the phonetic differences. Regardless of its precise origin, the name stuck, and Geronimo became synonymous with fierce resistance against both Mexican and American forces. The conflict between Geronimo's Apache band and the Mexicans was relentless, characterized by frequent attacks and counterattacks. One particularly notable encounter occurred in December 1860 when a group of 30 miners launched a surprise assault on an Apache camp along the Mimbres River. The miners, acting independently of the military, killed 4 Apache warriors, wounded several others, and captured 13 women and children. This unprovoked attack sparked a series of retaliatory raids by the Apache, not only against the Mexicans, but also against U.S. citizens and their property. The cycle of violence escalated, further entrenching the animosity between the Apache and their adversaries. Despite such treacherous setbacks, Geronimo remained a symbol of defiance. From 1858 to 1886, he led countless raids and daring escapes, earning a reputation for his tactical brilliance and near-supernatural ability to evade capture. One of the most legendary stories associated with Geronimo involves a cave in the Robledo Mountains of southwestern New. Geronimo's life and leadership were defined by his ability to inspire fear and respect, not just among his enemies but among his own people. His extraordinary skills as a warrior, healer, and leader elevated him to a near-mythical status, and his defiance in the face of overwhelming odds remains one of the most enduring stories in Native American history. Even in captivity, Geronimo continued to symbolize the struggle for freedom and self-determination, a struggle that continues to resonate in the ongoing fight for Native rights and recognition in the United States today. After each escape from the reservations, Geronimo and his band would traverse the hostile landscapes of Arizona and New Mexico, often retreating deep into Mexico's rugged Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains. These mountains, straddling the border between the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, provided a perfect natural refuge for the Apaches. The dense, isolated terrain made it nearly impossible for U.S. forces to pursue them effectively. In these remote strongholds, Geronimo and his followers could regroup, recover, and plan their next moves. From these hideouts, they launched raids on Mexican and U.S. territories, targeting small villages, haciendas, wagon trains, and even worker camps. The raiding provided not only a means of survival, but also a way to restock their supplies, particularly firearms and ammunition, which were essential for their continued resistance. That night, one of the soldiers providing Geronimo's band with whiskey warned them that they would be in mortal danger as soon as they crossed the border back into the United States. Fearing betrayal, Geronimo, along with Nakite and 39 of his followers, slipped away under the cover of darkness, disappearing into the rugged mountains once again. This escape infuriated General Crook, who had been tasked with ending the Apache resistance. The subsequent exchange of heated telegrams between Crook and General Philip Sheridan, his superior, reflected the frustration of the U.S. government at Geronimo's continued defiance. On April 1, 1886, Crook, disillusioned by the situation, requested to be relieved of his command, a request that Sheridan promptly granted.